Simon & Schuster Audio, in association with Anthony Harris and Susan Kendall Newman, present Jack Lemmon reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain.
You don't know about me unless you've read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that don't matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That's nothing. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another, except an Aunt Polly or the widow. Aunt Polly, Tom's Aunt Polly, she is, and the widow Douglas is all told about in that book, which is mostly a true book, with some stretchers, as I said before. Now, the way that the book winds up is this. Tom and me found money that robbers hid in a cave, and it made us rich. We got $6,000 apiece, all gold. It was an awful sight of money when it was piled up. Well, Judge Thatcher took it and put it out at interest, and it fetched us $1 a day apiece all the year round. More than a body could tell what to do with. The widow Douglas took me for her son and allowed she would civilize me. But it was rough living in the house all the time, considering how dismal, regular, and decent the widow was in all her ways. And so when I couldn't stand it no longer, I lit out. I got into my old rags and my sugar hogshead again and was free and satisfied. But Tom Sawyer hunted me up, said he was going to start a band of robbers. I might join if I'd go back to the widow and be respectable. So I went back. The widow, she cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb, and she called me a lot of other names too, but she never meant no harm by it. She put me in them new clothes again, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Then the old thing commenced again. The widow rung a bell for supper, and you had to come on time. When you got to the table, you couldn't go right to eating, but you had to wait for the widow to tuck down her head and grumble a little over the victuals, though there weren't really anything the matter with them. That is, nothing, only everything was cooked by itself. In a barrel of odds and ends, it's different. Things get mixed up and the juice kind of swaps around and the things go better. Her sister, Miss Watson, a tolerable slim old maid with goggles on, had just come to live with her and took to me after supper with a spelling book. She worked me middling hard for about an hour, and then the widow made her ease up. I couldn't have stood it much longer. Then for an hour it was deadly dull and I was fidgety. Miss Watson would say, "Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry, and don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry. Set up straight." Then she told me all about the bad place, and I said I wished I was there. She got mad then, but I didn't mean no harm. All I wanted was to go somewheres. All I wanted was a change. I weren't particular. Pap, he hadn't been seen for more than a year, and that was comfortable for me. I didn't want to see him no more. He used to always wail on me when he was sober and could get his hands on me. Well, about this time he was found in the river drownded about 12 miles above town, so people said. They judged it was him anyway, said this drownded man was just his size and was ragged and had uncommon long hair, which was all like Pap. But they couldn't make nothing out of the face because it had been in the water so long it weren't much like a face at all. They said he was floating on his back in the water. They took him and buried him on the bank. But I weren't comfortable long because I happened to think of something. I knowed mighty well that a drownded man don't float on his back but on his face. So I knowed then that this warn't Pap, but a woman dressed up in a man's clothes. I judged the old man would turn up again by and by, though I wished he wouldn't. Tom Sawyer's gang played robber now and then about a month, and then I resigned. All the boys did. We hadn't robbed nobody, but only just pretended. We used to hop out of the woods and go charging down on hog drovers and women in carts taking garden stuff to market, but we never hurt any of them. Tom Sawyer called the hogs ingots, and he called the turnips and stuff jewelry, and we'd go to the cave and powwow over what we had done and how many people we'd killed and marked. But I couldn't see no profit in it. Well, 3 or 4 months run along, and it was well into winter now. I had been to school most all the time and could spell and read and write just a little and could say the multiplication table up to 6 times 7 is 35. And I don't reckon I could ever get any further than that if I was to live forever. I don't take no stock in mathematics anyway. At first I hated the school, but by and by I got so I could stand it. Whenever I got uncommon tired, I played hooky, and the beating I got the next day done me good and cheered me up. So the longer I went to school, the easier it got to be. I was getting sort of used to the widow's ways, too, and they weren't so raspy on me. One morning, I happened to turn over the salt cellar at breakfast. I reached for some of it as quick as I could to throw over my left shoulder and keep off the bad luck. But Miss Watson was in ahead of me and crossed me off. She says, "Take your hands away, Huckleberry. What a mess you're always making." The widow put in a good word for me, but that weren't going to keep off the bad luck. I knowed that well enough. I started out after breakfast feeling worried and shaky and wondering where it was going to fall on me. I went down the front garden and clumb over the stile where you go through the high board fence. There was an inch of new snow on the ground, and I seen somebody's tracks. It was funny they hadn't come in after standing around so. I didn't notice anything at first, but next I did. There was a cross in the left boot heel made with big nails to keep off the devil. I was up in a second and running down the hill. Miss Watson's slave, Jim, had a hairball as big as your fist, which he took out of the fourth stomach of an ox, and he used to do magic with it. So I went to him that night and told him Pap was here again, for I found his tracks in the snow. What I wanted to know was, what was he going to do, and was he going to stay? Jim got out his hairball and said something over it, and then he held it up and dropped it to the floor. Jim got down on his knees and put his ear against it and listened. He said it would tell my whole fortune if I wanted it to. I says, "Go on." So the hairball talked to Jim, and Jim told it to me. He says, "Your old father don't know yet what he's a-gonna do. Sometimes he spec he'll go away, and then again he spec he'll stay. There's 2 angels hovering round him. One of 'em is white and shiny, and t'other one is black. The white one gets him to go right a little while, then the black one sail in and bust it all up. A body can't tell which one's gonna fetch him at the last. But you is all right." When I lit my candle and went up to my room that night, there sat Pap, his own self. I used to be scared of him all the time. He tanned me so much. I reckon I was scared now, too, but in a minute I see I was mistaken. That is, after the first jolt, when my breath sort of hitched, he being so unexpected. But right away after I see him, I weren't scared of him worth bothering about. He was most 50, and he looked it. His hair was long and tangled and greasy and hung down, and you could see his eyes shining through like he was behind vines. There weren't no color in his face where his face showed. It was white, not like another man's white, but a white to make a body's flesh crawl, a tree-toad white, a fish-belly white. As for his clothes, just rags, that was all. He had one ankle resting on t'other knee. The boot on that foot was busted and 2 of his toes stuck through. I stood a-looking at him. He sat there a-looking at me with his chair tilted back a little. I set the candle down. I noticed the window was up, so he'd clumb in by the shed. He kept a-looking me all over. By and by he says, "Starchy clothes, very. You think you're a good deal of a big bug, don't you?" "Well, maybe I am, maybe I ain't," I says. "Don't you give me none of your lips," says he. "You put on considerable many frills since I've been away. I'll take you down a peg before I get done with you. You're educated too, they say, can read and write, huh? You think you're better than your father now, don't you, because he can't? I'll take it out of you. Oh, ain't you a sweet-scented dandy, though? A bed clothes, and a looking-glass, and a piece of carpet on the floor. And your own father got to sleep with the hogs in the yard. I never see such a son. I bet I'll take some of those frills out of you before I'm done with you. Why, there ain't no end to your heirs. They say you're rich. They lie. I've been in town 2 days and I ain't heard nothing but about you being rich. I heard about it away down the river, too. That's why I come. You get me that money tomorrow. I want it. I ain't got no money. It's a lie. Judge Thatcher's got it. You get it. I ain't got no money, I tell you. So how much you got in your pocket? I want it. I ain't got only $1, and I want that too. It don't make no difference what you want it for. You just shell it out. He took it and bit it to see if it was good, and then he said he was going downtown to get some whiskey. Said he hadn't had a drink all day. When he got out on the shed, he put his head in again and cussed me for putting on frills and trying to be better than him. And when I reckoned he was gone, he came back and put his head in again and told me to mind about that school because he was going to lay for me and lick me if I didn't drop that. Next day, he was drunk and he went to Judge Thatcher's and bully-ragged him and tried to make him give up the money, but he couldn't. And then he swore he'd make the law force him. The judge and the widow went to law to get the court to take me away from him and let one of them be my guardian. But it was a new judge that had just come, and he didn't know the old man. So he said courts mustn't interfere and separate families if they could help it. That pleased the old man till he couldn't rest. He said he'd cowhide me till I was black and blue if I didn't raise some money for him. I borrowed $3 from Judge Thatcher, and Pap took it and got drunk and went blowing round and cussing and whooping and carrying on, and then they jailed him. And next day they had him before the court and jailed him again for a week. But he said he was satisfied, said he was boss of his son. Well, pretty soon the old man was up and around again, and then he went for Judge Thatcher in the courts to make him give up that money, and he went for me too for not stopping school. He catched me a couple of times and thrashed me, but I went to school just the same, and I dodged him or outrun him most of the time. Every now and then I'd borrow $2 or $3 off the judge for him to keep from getting a cowhiding. Every time he got money, he got drunk and raised Cain around town, and every time he raised Cain, he got jailed. He was just suited. This kind of thing was right in his line. He got to hanging around the widows too much, and she told him at last that if he didn't quit hanging around there, she would make trouble for him. Well, wasn't he mad? He said he'd show who was Huck Finn's boss. So he watched out for me one day in the spring and catched me and took me up the river about 3 miles in a skiff and crossed over to the Illinois shore where it was woody and there weren't no houses but an old log hut in a place where the timber was so thick you couldn't find it if you didn't know where it was. He kept me with him all the time and I never got a chance to run off. We lived in that old cabin and he always locked the door and put the key under his head nights. He had a gun which he had stole, I reckon, and we fished and hunted and that was what we lived on. Every little while he locked me in and went down to the store 3 miles and traded fish and game for whiskey and fetched it home and got drunk and licked me. The widow, she found out where I was by and by, and she sent a man over to try to get a hold of me. But Pap drove him off with the gun, and it weren't long after that till I was used to being where I was and liked it. All but the cowhide part. It was kind of lazy and jolly, laying off comfortable all day, smoking and fishing, and no books nor study. 2 months or more run along, and my clothes got to be all rags and dirt, and I didn't see how I'd ever got to like it so well at the widow's, where you had to wash and eat on a plate and comb up and go to bed and get up regular and be forever bothering over a book. But by and by, Pap got too handy with his belt, and I couldn't stand it. I was all over welts. He got to going away so much, too, and locking me in. Once he locked me in and was gone 3 days. It was dreadful lonesome. I judged he'd got drowned and I wasn't ever going to get out anymore. I was scared. I made up my mind I'd fix up some way to leave there. I had tried to get out of that cabin many a time, but I couldn't find no way. There weren't a window to it big enough to get a dog through. I couldn't get up the chimney. It was too narrow. The door was thick, solid oak slabs. Pap was pretty careful not to leave a knife or anything in the cabin when he was away. I reckon I'd hunted the place over as much as 100 times. Well, I was most all the time at it because it was about the only way to put in the time. But this time I found something at last. I found an old rusty wood saw without any handle. It was laid in between a rafter and the clapboards of the roof. I greased it up and went to work. There was an old horse blanket nailed against the logs behind the table to keep the wind from blowing through the chinks and putting the candle out. I got under the table and raised the blanket and went to work to saw a section of the bottom log out, big enough to let me through. Well, it was a good long job, but I was getting towards the end of it when I heard Pap's gun in the woods. I dropped the blanket and hid my saw, and pretty soon Pap come. Pap warn't in a good humor, so he was his natural self. He said he was downtown and everything was going wrong. His lawyer said he reckoned he would win his lawsuit and get the money if they ever got started on the trial, but then there was ways to put it off a long time, and Judge Thatcher knowed how to do it. And he said people allowed there'd be another trial to get me away from him and give me to the widow for my guardian, and they guessed it would win this time. Then the old man got to cussing and cussed everything and everybody he could think of, and then cussed 'em all over again to make sure he hadn't skipped any. The old man made me go to the skiff and fetch the things he had got. There was a 50-pound sack of cornmeal, a side of bacon, ammunition, and a 4-gallon jug of whiskey, and an old book and 2 newspapers for wadding, besides some tow. I toted up a load and went back and sat down on the bow of the skiff to rest. And I noticed some pieces of limbs and such things floating down and a sprinkling of bark, so I knowed the river had begun to rise. The June rise used to be luck for me, because as soon as that rise begins, here comes cordwood floating down and pieces of log rafts, sometimes a dozen logs together, so all you have to do is catch 'em and sell 'em to the wood yards and the sawmill. I went along up the bank with one eye out for Pap and t'other one out for what the rise might fetch along. Well, all at once here comes a canoe. Just a beauty, too, about 13, 14 foot long. I shot head first off the bank like a frog, clothes and all, and struck out for the canoe. I just expected there'd be somebody laying down in it because people often done that to fool folks, but it weren't so this time. It was a drift canoe sure enough, and I clumb in and paddled her ashore. As I was running her into a little creek like a gully all hung over with vines and willows, I struck another idea. I'd hide her good, and instead of taking to the woods when I run off, I'd go down the river about 50 mile and camp in one place for good, and not have such a rough time tramping on foot. It was pretty close to the shanty, and I thought I heard the old man coming all the time, but I got her hid. And then I out and looked around a bunch of willows, and there was the old man down the path a piece, just drawing a bead on a bird with his gun, so he hadn't seen anything. When he got along, I was hard at it taking up a trot line. I knowed he'd see I was wet, and then he would be asking questions. He abused me a little for being so slow, but I told him I fell in the river, and that was what made me so long. We got 5 catfish off the lines. The river was coming up pretty fast, and lots of driftwood going by on the rise. By and by, along comes part of a log raft, 9 logs fast together. We went out with the skiff and towed it ashore, then we had dinner. Anybody but Pap would have waited so as to catch more stuff, but that weren't Pap's style. 9 logs was enough for one time. He must shove right over to town and sell. So he locked me in and took off. I judged he wouldn't come back that night. I waited till I reckoned he had a good start, then I out with my saw and went to work on that log again. Before he was t'other side of the river, I was out of the hole. I took the sack of cornmeal and took it to where the canoe was hid. Then I done the same with the side of bacon and then the whiskey jug. I took all the coffee and sugar there was, and all the ammunition and my old saw and 2 blankets and the skillet and the coffee pot. I took fish lines and matches and other things, everything that was worth a cent. I cleaned out the place. I wanted an axe, but there weren't any, only the one out at the woodpile, and I knowed why I was going to leave that. I fetched out the gun, and now I was done. I had wore the ground a good deal crawling out of the hole and dragging out so many things, so I fixed that as good as I could from the outside by scattering dust on the place. Then I fixed the piece of log back into its place. If you stood 4 or 5 foot away and didn't know it was sawed, you wouldn't never notice it. It was all grass clear to the canoe, so I hadn't left a track. I stood on the bank and looked out over the river. All safe. So I took the gun and went up a piece into the woods and was hunting around for some birds when I see a wild pig. I shot this fella and took him into camp. I took the axe and smashed in the cabin door. I fetched the pig in and took him back nearly to the table and hacked into his throat with the axe and laid him down on the ground to bleed. Next, I took an old sack and put a lot of big rocks in it, all I could drag, and started it from the pig and dragged it to the door and through the woods down to the river and dumped it in, and down it sunk, out of sight. He would take an interest in this kind of business and throw in the fancy touches. Well, last I pulled out some of my hair and blooded the axe good and stuck it on the back side and slung the axe in the corner. Then I took up the pig and held him to my breast with my jacket so he couldn't drip, till I got a good piece below the house, and then I dumped him into the river. Now I thought of something else, so I went and got the bag of meal and my old saw out of the canoe and fetched them to the house. I took the bag to where it used to stand and ripped a hole in the bottom with the saw. Then I carried the sack about 100 yards across the grass to a shallow lake. There was a slough or a creek leading out of it on the other side that went miles away, I don't know where, but it didn't go to the river. The meal sifted out and made a little track all the way to the lake. Then I tied up the rip in the meal sack with a string so it wouldn't leak no more, and took it and my saw to the canoe again. It was about dark now, so I dropped the canoe down the river under some willows that hung over the bank and waited for the moon to rise. I says to myself, they'll follow the track of that sack full of rocks to the shore and then drag the river for me. And they'll follow that mule track to the lake to find the robbers that killed me and took the things. They won't ever hunt the river for anything but my dead carcass. They'll soon get tired of that and won't bother no more about me. I can stop anywhere I want to. Jackson's Island is good enough for me. I know that island pretty well. Nobody ever comes there. And then I can paddle over to the town nights and slink around and pick up things I want. Jackson's Island's the place. It didn't take me long to get to the island. I shot past the head at a ripping rate, the current was so swift. And then I got into the dead water and landed on the side toward the Illinois shore. I ran the canoe into a deep dent in the bank that I knowed about. I had to part the willow branches to get in, and when I made fast, nobody could have seen the canoe from the outside. There was a little gray in the sky now, so I stepped into the woods and laid down for a nap before breakfast. The sun was up so high when I waked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I laid there in the grass in the cool shade thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. Well, I was dozing off again when I thinks I hears a deep sound of boom way up the river. You see, they was firing cannon over the water trying to make my carcass come to the top. The ferry boat was floating with the current. I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was aboard when she come along, because she would come in close. When she got pretty well along down towards me, I laid down behind a log on the bank in a little open space. Where the log forked, I could peep through. By and by, she come along, and she drifted in so close they could have run out a plank and walked ashore. Most everybody was on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher, and Becky Thatcher, and Joe Harper, and Tom Sawyer, and his old Aunt Polly, and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder, but the captain broke in and says, "Stand away!" And the cannon let off such a blast right before me that it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blind with the smoke. If they'd have had some bullets in, I reckon they'd have got the corpse they was after. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the booming now and then, further and further off, and by, after an hour, I didn't hear it no more. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I catched a catfish and haggled him open with my saw, and toward sundown I started my campfire and had supper. And then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I went and sat on the bank and listened to the currents washing along, and counted the stars and drift logs and rafts that came down, and then went to bed. So for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it. Well, I went fooling along in the deep woods till I judged I weren't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection. I thought I'd kill some game close to home. I clipped along, and all of a sudden I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as ever I could. When I got to camp, I weren't feeling very brash. I got all my traps into my canoe again so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing, I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. By and by I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm going to find out who it is that's here on this island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across that campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I hadn't no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of fire away through the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by, I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gapped and stretched and hove off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him. I says, "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared at me wild. Then he drops down on his knees and puts his hands together and says, "Don't hurt me, don't. I ain't ever done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people and done all I could for 'em." Well, I weren't long making him understand I weren't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I weren't lonesome now. Then he says, "But looky here, Huck. Who was it that was killed in that shanty if it warn't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. And then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim? You wouldn't tell on me if I was to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off. See, it was this way. Old Mrs., that's Miss Watson, she pecks on me all the time, but she always said she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans. But I noticed there was a slave trader around the place considerable lately, and I began to get uneasy. Well, one night I creeps to the door pretty late, and the door weren't quite shut, and I hear old Mrs. tell the widder she gonna sell me down to Orleans. She didn't want to, but she could get $800 for me, and it was such a big stack of money she couldn't resist. The widder, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. Some young birds came along, flying a yard or two at a time and lighting. Jim said it was a sign it was going to rain. He said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and so he reckoned it was the same way when young birds done it. I wanted to go and look at a place right about the middle of the island that I'd found when I was exploring, so we started and soon got to it because the island was only 3 miles long and a 1/4 mile wide. The place was a tolerable long, steep hill or ridge about 40 foot high. We had a rough time getting to the top. The sides were so steep and the bushes so thick. We tramped and clumb around all over it, and by found a good big cavern in the rock, most up to the top on the side towards Illinois. The cavern was as big as 2 or 3 rooms bunched together, and Jim could stand up straight in it. Jim said if we had the canoe hid in a good place and had all the traps in the cavern, we could rush there if anybody was to come to the island, and they would never find us without dogs. And besides, he said them little birds had said it was gonna rain, and did I want things to get wet? So we went back, got the canoe, and paddled up abreast of the cavern, and lugged all the traps up there. Then we hunted up a place close by to hide the canoe in amongst the thick willows. We spread the blankets inside the cavern for a carpet and eat our dinner in there. We put all the other things handy at the back of the cavern, and pretty soon it darkened up and begun to thunder and lighten, so the birds was right about it. Directly it begun to rain, and it rained like all fury, too, and I never see the wind blow so. "Jim, this is nice," I say. "I wouldn't want to be nowhere else but here. Pass me along another hunk of fish and some hot cornbread, huh?" "Well, you wouldn't have been here if it hadn't have been for Jim. You'd have been there in the woods without any dinner and getting most drownded, too. That you would, honey. Chickens knows when it's gonna rain, and so do the birds, child." The river went on raising and raising for 10 or 12 days till at last it was over the banks. And one night we catched a little section of a lumber raft, nice pine planks. It was 12 foot wide and about 15 or 16 foot long, and the top stood above water 6 or 7 inches, a solid level floor. Another night when we was up at the head of the island just before daylight, here comes a frame house down on the west side. She was a 2-story and tilted over considerable. We paddled out and got aboard, clumb in at an upstairs window. There was something laying on the floor in the far corner that looked like a man, so Jim says, "Hello, you!" But it didn't budge. So I hollered again, and then Jim says, "The man ain't asleep. He's dead. You hold still. I'll go and see." He went and bent down and looked and says, "It's a dead man. He'd been shot in the back. I reckon he's been dead 2 or 3 days. Come in, Huck, but don't look at his face. It's too gashly." I didn't look at him at all. Jim throwed some old rags over him, but he needn't done it. I didn't want to see him. There was heaps of old greasy cards scattered around over the floor and old whiskey bottles. There was 2 old dirty calico dresses and a sunbonnet and some women's underclothes hanging against the wall and some men's clothing too. We put the lot into the canoe. There was a boy's old speckled straw hat on the floor. I took that too. We got an old tin lantern and a butcher knife without any handle, and a brand new Barlow knife worth 2 bits in any store, and a lot of tallow candles, a tin candlestick and a tin cup, and a ratty old bed quilt off the bed, and a hatchet and some nails, and a fish line as thick as my little finger with some monstrous hooks on it. And so, take it all around, we made a good haul. After breakfast, I wanted to talk about the dead man and guess how he come to be killed, but Jim didn't want to. He said it would fetch bad luck. And beside, he said he might come and haint us. He said a man that warn't buried was more likely to go a-hainting around than one that was planted and comfortable. We rummaged the clothes we'd got and found $8 in silver sewed up in the lining of an old blanket overcoat. Jim said he reckoned the people in that house stole the coat because if they'd have knowed the money was there, they wouldn't have left it. I said I reckoned they killed him too, but Jim didn't want to talk about that.